Remember last week we talked about the beginning of the book of Exodus. We saw how it made a connection with the book of Genesis, and then how Moses was called and how God revealed his name to Moses. And one of the things we noticed is that Moses was very much a reluctant hero. He really didn't want to go forth and do what God asked him. On 7 different occasions, he raises objections, but eventually God insists. And what's most important of that first section is that God revealed his name to Moses and so to the people of Israel. And God reveals himself in this way. He says, I am who I will be. So on the one hand, he gives them his name. His name is Yahweh, he is. But on the other hand, it's an elusive name. It doesn't tell Israel anything. It's almost like a promise that you'll discover who God is by what God does. Now, today, we're going to look at 2 more sections of the book of Genesis, and this green handout will be helpful to you. First of all, we're going to look at the 10 plagues, and you can see from my handout that what I have done is to divide them into 3, 3, 3, and then the 10th plague. In a little while, I'll explain why I did that. And one of the things you'll notice in these plagues is the constant reference at the beginning to Pharaoh hardening his heart and refusing to do what Moses asked. And then by the end, God hardening the heart of Pharaoh to make sure that Pharaoh, in fact, doesn't do what Moses asks of him. The 10th plague is going to be the most important, and that is the plague when the angel of God, which is another way of talking about God himself, passes over the house of the Israelites. Now, God will destroy the firstborn of all the Egyptians, but God will pass over the house of the Israelites because they will have put the blood of the Paschal lamb on the lintel of the door. So that's where you get this notion of the Passover. So again, if you just take a look at the handout on the back side of the page, after the 9th plague, you'll note that the 10th plague is, first of all, described what is going to happen, and then the story will get interrupted as the Passover ritual is described, and then finally the plague will actually be carried out. And when this plague is carried out, it will be at that point that Pharaoh will be a broken man and actually cast the people out. He doesn't want them there anymore. And so this is the origin of the Passover supper, and this is a central part of Israel's redemption. Then, once the people leave Egypt, they are going to pass through the Red Sea. So we'll talk a little bit about the story of the Exodus, the deliverance of Israel at the Red Sea. But let's now go back to the beginning in chapter 8, verse 7 to 13. Now, obviously, a lot of material here, so I'm not going to try to read or summarize all of it, but to give some high points. You'll notice that in this little section, chapter 7, verse 8 to 13, there is an initial meeting between Moses and Aaron and Pharaoh. And at this initial meeting, Aaron casts down his staff, and it turns into a serpent. But the Egyptian magicians do the same thing by their magic. And so the section ends in verse 13. Pharaoh, however, hardened his heart, and he would not listen to them, just as the Lord had foretold. So Moses and Aaron come to Pharaoh, this initial meeting. They ask that the people be able to go into the wilderness. They give a sign of Aaron throwing the staff. It turns into the serpent. The magicians of Egypt are able to do the same thing, so Pharaoh doesn't think this is very important at all. And notice at the beginning, it's Pharaoh who hardens his heart. Now, we move into the first group of 3 plagues. And the first one is that the water throughout Egypt, the Nile itself, will be turned into blood. The second will be these frogs coming up from the Nile. And the third will be the plague of gnats. Now there's a pattern here. Why have I divided them into 3, 3, and 3? Because you'll notice in each of these sections of 3, in the first plague, God tells Moses to go out in the morning and meet Pharaoh somewhere publicly. In the second plague of the 3, Moses will then meet Pharaoh. God will again tell Moses to go out and meet Pharaoh. And then in the third encounter, there will be no meeting as such, but Moses will simply threaten Pharaoh about what is going to happen. So let me show you what I mean. The first plague is that the water is turned into blood. So it begins in this way in verse 14 with the Lord, that is to say Yahweh, saying to Moses, Pharaoh is obstinate in refusing to let the people go. In the morning, just when he sets out for the water, go to Pharaoh and present yourself by the bank of the Nile. So God tells Moses to meet Pharaoh in a public place in the morning. And he goes and he simply says, let my people go to serve in the wilderness. And Pharaoh will otherwise, he threatens that God is going to strike the water of the Nile. It will turn into blood, and there will not be any fresh water in the whole land of Egypt. Now, what happens after this is going to seem very strange to you. Lots of things will seem strange to you, but you have to remember that this is not just a newspaper or historical report. So Moses and Aaron do what the Lord asked them. They strike the waters with their staff and they turn into blood. The waters turn into blood. And then in verse 22, the text says, but the Egyptian magicians did the same by their magic arts. So Pharaoh hardened his heart. It would not listen to them, just as the Lord had said. Well, if you're puzzled, of course you should be puzzled. If Moses has turned all the waters into blood, how can the Egyptians do the same thing? But this is not a problem for the biblical author. He simply wants to make the point at this early stage that whatever Moses and Aaron can do, the magicians can do. Eventually this will change. So they can do the same thing. So again, Pharaoh hardens his heart. He will not listen to Moses. Now, the second plague is going to be the plague of frogs in chapter 7, verse 25. Now, notice in verse 25, 7 days passed, and the Lord struck the Nile. Then the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh and tell him, let my people serve me. And he threatens them, if you don't, I will send a plague of frogs on all your territory. Again, the same thing happens. In chapter 8, verse 3, the text says, but the magicians did the same thing by their magic arts and made the frogs overrun the land of Egypt. And you would say, why would they even do that? But that's not the point. That's not the point. At the beginning, the narrator is trying to show you that the magicians are doing the same thing. Eventually, they won't be able to anymore. So the second plague doesn't bother Pharaoh at all. Again, before he hardens his heart, you'll notice a change. In chapter 8, verse 4, when the frogs do come, Pharaoh summons Moses and says, pray to the Lord to remove the frogs from me and my people, and I'll let your people sacrifice to the Lord. So there's a little change in Pharaoh. But no sooner, so Moses arranges a time when this will happen. When it happens, Pharaoh changes his mind again. And so the second plague ends with these words in chapter 8, verse 11. When Pharaoh saw that there was a respite, he became obstinate and would not listen to them, just as the Lord said. So Yahweh had foretold that Pharaoh would harden his heart, and again, it's happened a second time. So now we have a third plague. But this time there's not the same kind of meeting. In chapter 8, verse 12, thereupon the Lord spoke to Moses, speak to Aaron, stretch out your staff, strike the dust of the earth, and it will turn into gnats. So these little insects that are going to affect everybody. Now something changes, however. If you look at verse 14, though the magicians did the same thing to produce the gnats by their magic, they could not do so. Now you understand, I think, why in the first two plagues, the narrator said the magicians could do what Moses and Aaron did, but now they can't do it anymore. So you see, there's going to be a growth or development here in the story. And as a matter of fact, the magicians even say to Pharaoh in verse 15, this is the finger of God. So the magicians are beginning to understand that there's more than they can cope with here. But not Pharaoh, because in verse 15, yet Pharaoh hardened his heart and would not listen to them, just as the Lord had said. So Pharaoh remains constant in his obstinacy. The magicians are beginning to see that something is happening there because they can't do everything that Moses and Aaron did. That now brings us to the second group of three plagues. They're going to be the plague of flies, of pestilence, and of boils. And so in chapter 8, verse 16 to 18, again, it starts in the same way. The Lord speaks to Moses early in the morning, present yourself to Pharaoh when he goes toward the water. Just like in the first plague, God told Moses to meet Pharaoh early in the morning at in the water. And then he says, he tells them, let my people serve you, otherwise swarms of flies will come upon you. But now something else begins to happen. If you look at verse 18, but on that day I will make an exception in the land of Goshen, where my people, the Israelites, are, and no swarms of flies will be there, so that you, Pharaoh, may know that that I am the Lord in the midst of the land. I will make a distinction between my people and your people. Keep in mind that Pharaoh is a god to his people. And so what this whole contest is about is to show who really is in charge, who really is God. So this happens the next day, and now it seems that Pharaoh is repentant in chapter 8, verse 21. Then Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Go sacrifice to your God within the land." But Moses says, well, we just can't sacrifice here in Egypt. We have to go out 3 days' journey to sacrifice. And eventually, Pharaoh says, okay, I'll let you sacrifice to the Lord, provided you don't go too far away. But again, you almost expect what's going to happen. Pharaoh changes his mind. So once more, verse 28, Pharaoh becomes obstinate and won't let the people go. So the same thing begins to happen over and over again. Now we come to the 5th plague, and again, as in the 2nd plague, Moses is sent to meet Pharaoh. Then the Lord, Yahweh, said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh and tell him, 'Thus says the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, let my people go.'" And he says, if you don't, I'm going to destroy all of your livestock. But again, God promises in verse 4 to make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of the Egyptians. And so all of the livestock, all of the animals of the Egyptians are destroyed in this plague, but not the livestock of the Hebrews, of Israel. But again, despite this, in verse 7, chapter 9, verse 7, Pharaoh remains obstinate and won't let the people go. So, you can see what's happening here. Pharaoh is being set up as someone, no matter what you show or do him, will not give in to Yahweh as the true God. Then we come to the 6th plague, and now there is no meeting, as in the 3rd plague, between Moses and Pharaoh. Simply, God is going to threaten Pharaoh and not even tell him what he's going to do. So in chapter 9, verse 8, so the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Each of you take handfuls of soot from a kiln and throw it in the air, and the fine dust will become festering boils on the skin of all the people." Then notice in verse 11, because of the boils, the magicians could not stand in Pharaoh's presence, for there were boils on the magicians as well as on the rest of the Egyptians. But the Lord, now there's a change. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not listen to them, the magicians, just as the Lord had told Moses. So now we're going to notice a little change. At the beginning, Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Now you're going to see more references to God actually hardening the heart of Pharaoh. And of course, our first reaction is, this is unfair. I suppose it's unfair, but something else is going on here. First of all, Pharaoh has hardened his heart, so now he's going to be punished for that. But secondly, Pharaoh is an instrument who's going to be used by God to show God's glory, not only to Pharaoh himself, but to all of the Israelites and all of the Egyptians. This now brings us to the 3rd cycle of 3 plagues. And again, the 7th plague is going to be the plague of this hail. And once more, Moses and Aaron are sent out to meet Pharaoh in a public way. So in chapter 9, verse 13, the Lord, Yahweh, spoke to Moses, "Early tomorrow morning, present yourself to Pharaoh and tell him, 'Let my people serve me.'" And then he warns Pharaoh, "By this you will know my power, and my name." Well, let me back up a bit to verse 15. "For by now I should," God is speaking, "have stretched out my hand and struck you, Pharaoh, and your people with such pestilence that you would have vanished from the earth. But this is why I have let you survive, to show you my power and to make my name resound throughout the whole earth." So now you understand why God is hardening Pharaoh's heart, because he wants the whole of Egypt to know who the true God is. So there's a warning in verse 19 for the Egyptians to bring their livestock out from the open field into shelter, otherwise the hail will destroy them. Now you may have asked yourself, hasn't the livestock already been destroyed? But there seems to be more livestock here. And again, what's probably happening here is there's a mixture of different sources. But again, these kinds of questions are not the questions of the biblical narrative. They're looking for something different. So the Egyptians, of course, don't listen to that, and all of their livestock is destroyed. The livestock of the Israelites is not destroyed. Verse 26, "Only in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites were, was there no hail." Now, in verse 27, Pharaoh sends for Moses and Aaron, and now notice Pharaoh is beginning to change. "I have sinned this time. The Lord is the just one, and I and my people are the ones at fault. Pray to the Lord. Enough of this thunder and hail." So you might say that Pharaoh is beginning to crack. He's beginning to realize that maybe the God of the Hebrews is stronger than he. And so he asks Moses to pray to God that the hail will stop. Of course it does. And as soon as it does, Pharaoh becomes obstinate again. So chapter 9, verse 34, "But Pharaoh, seeing that the rain and the hail and the thunder had ceased, sinned again and became obstinate, both he and his servants. In the hardness of his heart, Pharaoh would not let the Israelites go, just as Yahweh had said through Moses." That now brings us to the 8th plague, the second in the series of 3. And again, the Lord tells Moses to go out to Pharaoh. "I have made him and his servants obstinate." Now that's interesting. Again, God is the one who is described as making Pharaoh and his servants obstinate. Why? "So that I may perform these signs of mine among them, and that you, the people of Israel, may recount to your son and grandson how I made a fool of the Egyptians and what signs I did among them." So the whole purpose of the hardening of Pharaoh's heart is not only to show the Egyptians who the true God is, but also to show the Israelites as well. So now they have this great plague of locusts that comes upon the entire land. And in verse 7, now Pharaoh's own servants come to him, and they say to him, how long will he be a snare for us? Let the people go to serve the Lord their God. Do you not realize that Egypt is being destroyed? Despite the fact that his own people are telling him this, when his own people tell him this, first of all, Pharaoh bargains with Moses. And he says, okay, you can go, but your children have to stay here. Otherwise, you won't come back. And Moses says, no, we all have to go. And he agrees to that, but then again he changes his mind. Once Moses removes all the locusts from them, it says in verse 20, yet the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let the Israelites go. Okay, so at the beginning, it was mostly Pharaoh hardening his heart. Toward the end, it's God also hardening his heart. This brings us to the 9th plague, the third in the cycle of 3. And here it's a plague that is foreshadowing the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn. And it's a plague of darkness. So in chapter 10, the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward the sky, that over the land of Egypt there may be such darkness that one can feel it. So Moses stretches his hand over the sky, and for 3 days no one could see anything. It's almost a thick darkness. But again, God makes a distinction, but the Israelites had light where they lived. So in the land of Egypt, where the Israelites were, there was light, but where the Egyptians are, there's this intense darkness. Pharaoh then says, go and serve the Lord. It seems he's finally giving in. But then Moses says, well, we have to take all of our livestock with us. And Pharaoh says, no, you can't take your livestock with you. And in verse 27, the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he was unwilling to let them go. And Pharaoh then says to Moses, get out of my sight, don't come back again. The next time you see me, you will die. When you come to chapter 11, what happens here is that we don't immediately go to the 10th plague, which is the great plague that will cause Pharaoh to finally let the people go. First of all, it's simply announced. So in chapter 11, the Lord speaks to Moses, and he tells Moses, I'm going to bring one more plague upon Pharaoh and Egypt. After this one, he'll let you depart. In fact, he will drive you away. And so God instructs the people to tell the Israelites to ask all of their neighbors for articles of silver, gold, and articles of clothing. And God makes the hearts of all the Egyptians well disposed toward the Israelites, so that the Egyptians give the Israelites everything they want. And in fact, it's like they're despoiling the people, as they've won a victory and they're going to leave with all of the riches of Egypt. And Moses then is told by God that about midnight, verse 4 of chapter 11, I'll go forth through Egypt. Every firstborn in the land of Egypt will die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on the throne to the firstborn of the slave girl who is at the handmill. Not only that, the firstborn of all the animals will also be destroyed, even though we thought all the animals were destroyed all year. The Lord said to Moses, verse 9, Pharaoh will not listen to you, so that my wonders may be multiplied in your land. Thus, although Moses and Pharaoh performed all of these wonders in Pharaoh's presence, the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let the Israelites go from the land. Now, the 10th plague is only described, but it's not yet carried out. So that when you come to chapter 12, there's kind of an interlude in which the book of Exodus describes the Passover ritual. Now, you all know from our Jewish neighbors that they celebrate a Passover ritual every year about the same time that we celebrate Easter. And what they're celebrating, what they're remembering, is not only the Exodus from Egypt, but what led to the Exodus from Egypt, the striking down of the firstborn of the Egyptians. But their firstborn was not struck down because God tells them to put the blood of a new paschal lamb on the lintel or the doorpost of their home, so that the Lord passes over their house. So first of all, in chapter 12, the Passover ritual is described, and then it is promulgated. And Moses tells the people, first of all, how they should eat the Passover supper. And then secondly, he tells them to put the blood on the doorpost of their homes. Then when you come to chapter 12, verse 29, you have the description of this 10th plague. So I'm in chapter 12, verse 29. And so at midnight, the Lord struck down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh sitting on his throne to the firstborn of the prisoner in the dungeon, as well as the firstborn of the animals. Pharaoh arose in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was loud wailing throughout Egypt, for there was not a house without its dead, except the homes of the Israelites who had the blood of the paschal lamb on their doorposts. During the middle of the night, Pharaoh now summons Moses and Aaron, and he basically tells them to leave Egypt, to get out of Egypt. And so they depart from Egypt at that point. And if you look at chapter 12, verse 37, it kind of summarizes what is happening here. The Israelites set out from Ramesses for Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, not counting the children. A crowd of mixed ancestry also went with them with livestock in great number. And then in verse 40 it says the Israelites had stayed in Egypt 430 years. And verse 42, this was a night of vigil for the Lord, when the Lord brought them out of the land of Egypt. So on this night, the Israelites must keep a vigil for the Lord throughout this generation. Now, just a couple of words here. First of all, you might say, why would God be so vengeful? This, again, is just not fair by the way we see things today. But this is a contest between, you might say, two gods, Yahweh and Pharaoh. And Pharaoh has taken God's firstborn, the people of Israel. That's God's firstborn, and oppressed them and enslaved them. So now the real God, Yahweh, is going to destroy the firstborn of Pharaoh and all of Pharaoh's people and livestock, to make it very clear who the real God is, so that glory will come to Yahweh. The Egyptians will know that Yahweh is God, and of course the Israelites will know Yahweh is God. Again, before we actually get to the Exodus, there's kind of an interlude in verse 13, which describes another ritual. And this ritual is that in Israel, they would always sacrifice the firstborn of all of their animals to God as a reminder to them of what had happened at this time. But their firstborn of their children, they would not sacrifice. They would redeem them. They would buy them back. They'd present them to the temple and then buy them back as a reminder that God had redeemed or bought back them because they, Israel, are God's firstborn. So if you look at the end of chapter 13, or toward the end of it, it summarizes this, chapter 13, verse 13. Every human firstborn of your sons you must ransom, buy back. And when your son asks you later on, what does this mean? You will tell him, with a strong hand, Yahweh brought us out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. When Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed every firstborn in the land of Egypt, the firstborn of human being and beast alike. That is why I, an Israelite, sacrifice to Yahweh every male that opens the womb, and while I ransom every firstborn of my sons. It will be a sign on your hand and on your forehead that the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a strong hand. So now you can see the origin of the Passover ritual, which the Jews celebrate every year, which Jesus celebrated before the night of his own death. The Passover ritual is that supper that remembers how the angel of the Lord, namely God himself, passed over the house of the Israelites, because they were redeemed by or saved by the blood of the Paschal Lamb. Now, we as Christians take this same imagery and we talk about our own Passover from death to life, which is made possible by the blood of the new Paschal Lamb that was shed on the cross, the blood of Jesus. Okay? So now we're going to move to the second part of the narrative here, the deliverance of Israel at the Red Sea. And this begins in chapter 13, verse 17. Pharaoh has sent the Israelites and told them to leave. When they leave, the people of Israel, the people of the Egyptians, give them everything they ask, so that Israel is going to leave like a conquering army with all kinds of booty. We're told that they have now grown to a people the size of more than 500,000, 600,000. So they've become a very numerous nation, fulfilling the promises God made to Abraham, Jacob, and Isaac in the book of Genesis. Now, at the beginning, in chapter 13, verse 17, the narrator says that when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the Philistine land, though that was the nearest route. And so the narrator now knows what God is thinking. For God said, if the people see that they have to fight, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God could have let the people go by the land of the Philistines, by the Mediterranean Sea. That would have been the shortest route, but they would have had to fight the Philistines and they would have gone back. So God knew that. So he's going to reroute them in a very different way, taking them all the way down the Sinai Peninsula. When the Israelites leave Egypt, verse 19, Moses takes the bones of Joseph, because at the end of the book of Genesis, Joseph had told his brothers to make sure that when you finally leave this land, you take my bones and bring them to this other land. And then we're told that when God leads the people, he leads them during the day as a column of a cloud, a column of cloud that leads them during the day, and at night it turns into a torch of fire. So that's the presence of God who is actually leading Israel. Now, Moses is then told by God to have, in chapter 14, to have the people camp at a place called Pi-hahiroth and Migdal. And God wants the people to camp there because the Pharaoh will think that the people are wandering aimlessly in the desert. And then God says to Moses in chapter 14, verse 4, I will so harden Pharaoh's heart that he will pursue them. So God is not done with Pharaoh. Even though he's had these 10 plagues in which he's hardened Pharaoh's heart, the final victory is yet to come. Thus I will receive glory through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know I am Yahweh. So the whole point of this hardening theme is to let the Egyptians know that God is Yahweh, that Yahweh is God. So at one point then, in chapter 14, verse 5, Pharaoh says, what in the world have we done? We've released Israel from service. So Pharaoh now harnesses 600 chariots. And again, in verse 8, the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites while they were going out in triumph. When the Israelites see the Pharaoh and his chariots coming in chapter 14, verse 11, they now complain to Moses. Were there no burial places in Egypt that you brought us to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Did we not tell you in Egypt when we said, leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? Far better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. Once a slave, always a slave. Easier to be a slave than to be free. And of course, this pattern of complaining to Moses and to God will become a pattern that occurs in the rest of the book of Exodus and the book of Numbers as well. But Moses tells the people in verse 13 not to fear, because Yahweh will win the victory for you today. And he says in verse 14, Yahweh will fight for you. You only have to keep still. You don't have to do anything. And now another theme begins to emerge, that God, Yahweh, is a warrior. And we'll see that in a moment. A divine warrior. So they come to, we traditionally call it the Red Sea. It's, in the text, it's really called a sea of reeds. And the people seem trapped. Here's 600 chariots in back of them, the water in front of them. It's at that point that God tells Moses to lift up his staff and stretch it out. And the waters begin to part. And again, God says in verse 17, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in the waters after them, the Israelites, and I, Yahweh, will receive glory through Pharaoh and his army. The Egyptians will know that I, Yahweh, am Yahweh when I receive glory through Pharaoh and his chariots. So now, in the night, you have the Israelites here, you have the Egyptians there, and between them is this flaming torch which represents God. The Israelites cross the Red Sea, the waters have parted, and in verse 23, the Egyptians follow in pursuit. All Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen. But during the watch, just before dawn, the Lord looks down from the column of fiery cloud upon the Egyptians and throws them into a panic. He simply looks at the Egyptians, glances at them, and they fall into a panic, and their wheels get clogged, and they all try to flee because the Lord, Yahweh, is fighting for them against the Egyptians. The Lord then tells Moses to stretch out his hand once more, and of course the Egyptians are completely drowned and submerged in the Sea of Reeds. At the end of this, when verse 30, when Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the seashore, and saw the great power that Yahweh had shown against Egypt, the people feared Yahweh. It's not in the sense of being afraid, but total reverence. They now know that he is God. They believed in Yahweh, and they believed in Moses, his servant. Now, immediately following this, and this is a good way to end this section here, is a poem, a very ancient poem, probably earlier than this story itself, which celebrates this victory of Yahweh at the Red Sea. And I'll read the poem. Then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to Yahweh. I will sing to Yahweh, for he is gloriously triumphant. Horse and chariot he has cast into the sea. My strength and my refuge is Yahweh, and he has become my Savior. This is my God, I will praise him. The God of my father, I extol him. Yahweh is a warrior. Yahweh is a warrior. Yahweh is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and army he hurled into the sea. The elite of his officers were drowned in the Red Sea. The floodwaters covered them. They sank into the depths like a stone. Your right hand, Yahweh, magnificent in power. Your right hand, Yahweh, shattered the enemy. In your great majesty, you overthrew your adversaries. You loosened your wrath to consume them like stubble. At the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The flowing waters stood like a mound. The floodwaters foamed in the midst of the sea. The enemy boasted, the Egyptians, I will pursue and overtake them. I will divide spoil and have my fill of them. I will draw my sword and my hand will despoil them. But when you blew your breath, the sea covered them. Like lead, they sank in the mighty water. Who is like you among the gods, Yahweh? Who is like you, magnificent among the holy ones, awe-inspiring in deeds of renown, worker of wonders? When you stretched out your right hand, the earth swallowed them. In your love you led your people, you redeemed. In your strength you guided them to your holy dwelling. The people heard and quaked. Anguish gripped the dwellers in Philistia. Then were the chieftains of Edom dismayed, the nobles of Moab seized with trembling. All the inhabitants of Canaan melted away. Terror and dread fell upon them. By the might of your arm they became silent like stones, while your people, Yahweh, passed over. While the people whom you created passed over, you brought them in, you planted them on the mountain that is your own, the place you made the base for your throne, the sanctuary your hands establish. May Yahweh reign as king forever and ever. So it's a poem that celebrates this. So let me just summarize and draw some conclusions here. The 10 plagues are really, they set up a contest between Moses and Yahweh. And at the beginning, Pharaoh seems to be very much in charge. He's not at all impressed by any of these plagues that Yahweh performs through Moses and Aaron. But by the end, by the 10th plague, when his own firstborn is put to death, he really is a broken man. Pharaoh hardens his heart at the beginning of these plagues, but then eventually God hardens Pharaoh's heart in order to make him even more stubborn, so that God can show his glory to not only Israel, but to the Egyptians and Pharaoh himself. The plagues come to a climax in the death of the firstborn. And the reason for this is because Pharaoh afflicted the firstborn, God's firstborn, namely the people of Israel. God now destroys the firstborn of Pharaoh and all the Egyptians. The Passover supper commemorates how the Lord passed over the house of the Israelites and spared their firstborn. And the Exodus from Egypt recalls the passage through the waters of the Red Sea. Now, this Passover and Exodus, these are the central redemptive events of the Old Testament. Just as the central redemptive event of the New Testament is the death and the resurrection of Jesus, so the central redemptive event of what we call the Old Testament is the Passover and the Exodus. But what we as Christians have done is to take these two images of Passover and Exodus and now apply them to what happened in Jesus and to us. So we see that Jesus is the new Paschal Lamb, by whose blood we have passed over from death to life. We see that Jesus' exodus was an exodus from death to life that we follow as well. If you remember the gospel this past Sunday, the Transfiguration, Moses, Elijah, and Jesus were talking about the exodus that Jesus was going to perform at Jerusalem, namely his death that would lead to his resurrection. So all of these events now find their, for us as Christians, find their fullest meaning in the event of Jesus' death and resurrection, so that our Eucharist that we celebrate each time is the new Passover supper. And it reminds us of our exodus from death to life. The Passover reminds the Jewish people of their passage from slavery to freedom and how they were saved by the Paschal Lamb. The Eucharist is our Passover supper that reminds us of a new exodus from the death of sin to the life of grace made possible by the new Paschal Lamb, Jesus Christ. Okay. So there's a lot of things there. Yeah. Yeah, Greg.
I understand the whole point of showing this is kind of a battle between God and Pharaoh, but it seems to do great violence to the concept of free will. Is there any other part of the Old Testament that has God actually manipulating someone to do something that's not really their free act?
Well, first of all, the idea of the free will, that's very much from our point, a kind of almost a modern concept. In terms of the biblical literature, God is in control of everything. God says, I think it's in the book of Isaiah, I make good and I make evil. God is, and it would not have been surprising. I know it's surprising to us as contemporary readers, but for the biblical reader to hear that God hardens Pharaoh's heart would not have been surprising at all. This is what God does. God is in complete control. But let's back up just a bit more. But it starts off with Pharaoh hardening his own heart. And then at a certain point, it becomes God hardening Pharaoh's heart. So at a certain point, Pharaoh's, well, even this causes, it's as though Pharaoh is beyond redemption at a certain point. So you're going to harden his heart. Why? The purpose is not to punish Pharaoh. That's not the purpose. Pharaoh is a pawn in a bigger play. The purpose is to glorify God. Now again, that's not the way we think today, but that's the way the biblical author is thinking. Now you asked me are there any other instances where God is kind of in control here? Yeah, I think there are other instances.
In control to have someone do something that we would say is evil or wrong.
Yeah, to do something that's evil or wrong, yeah. No, I can't think of where God actually makes somebody. God will, in the book of Kings, when Absalom is revolting against his father David, God will have the counselors of Absalom give bad advice to him to do that. Because the notion of free will is sort of a Greek notion of Greek philosophy and then medieval theology. It's not central to this biblical narrative. But because something else is at work here. God is in control of everything. Even if you take the notion of free will, and that's what I would accept that we all have a free will. Ultimately, God is supreme. God is in control of everything. Not that he's manipulating everything, but God, I just don't know what to say at that point.
Father, can you go over again the thing about ransoming the firstborn?
Yeah. Okay. There are different rituals. You have these 10 plagues, and then you have the Exodus from Egypt. So how are the people of Israel going to memorialize this every year? Likewise, we have the passion and death of Jesus. How do we memorialize it? Well, we memorialize it by celebrating the Mass, and we memorialize it by the Easter Triduum. Okay. Now, Israel had a number of feasts or customs that they could memorialize this. So the Passover ritual, first of all, was a way of memorializing what happened that night when the avenging angel passed over, and then they were the Exodus. They had another ritual whereby in this agrarian society, they would bring the firstborn of the flock and offer it in sacrifice to God. They would also bring their child, the firstborn, but they wouldn't sacrifice the child. They would redeem the child, buy it back, as a reminder to them of how God redeemed or saved their firstborn at the Passover, and that night of the Passover. For example, in the Gospel of Luke, in the infancy narrative, when Mary and Joseph bring the child Jesus to the temple, they offer the gift of 2 turtle doves to redeem Jesus. He is their firstborn, so they offer him to the Lord, but only to buy him back, this act of redeeming them. So the firstborn is always offered to God, but then, if you will, brought back. And this is a way of remembering how God saved the firstborn of the Israelites at this time.
So that's only done with the firstborn in that time?
Yeah, because the firstborn is because God saved his firstborn, namely the people of Israel.
Thank you.
After everything happened in Exodus, when was it written down? I can picture a bunch of guys sitting around saying,
So,
we got to get this into it. We got to get that into it, and making these stories.
right. These events, this event of this group of people escaping from Egypt, is an event that there's at least some historical kernel there that occurs maybe about 1,200 years before the birth of Jesus. And these stories are written down pretty much in the form that we're reading them now, not exactly, maybe about 800 years later, after the period of the exile, in a circle of priests. But these priests are drawing upon different traditions and stories that have been handed on for a very, very long time. In some of these stories, the name Yahweh is actually used all the time. And so scholars call this the Yahweh source. In some of these other stories, the name for God, Elohim, is used, so they call this the Elohistic source. And then the priests had their own stories of this. So one of the reasons that there seem to be these contradictions within the narrative, we might say there are these contradictions within the narrative, is that they wove together disparate sources, all right? But they respected those sources. These people could also see the differences. They weren't oblivious to that, but for them they were all important. So to go back to your question again, let's say the events happened roughly about 1,200 years before the birth of Jesus. let's say that the events are put in a written form, more or less what we have today, about 400 years before the birth of Jesus. That means for about 800 years, these stories are told over and over in before campfires. And surely they're told in a way that, on the one hand, they communicate and remember a religious message. On the other hand, they're told in a way that it must have been delightful of how we once beat the Egyptians so badly, you know. So there's a kind of a humor in some of those stories. And maybe this is almost a better answer to the question Rick raised. You know, you could then see the Israelites, they would have no problem in saying God hardened Pharaoh's heart, you know. They're not worried about questions of free will at this point. Yeah, who won and how did he win, you know? So Pharaoh came and he was obstinate. So what did our God do? He made him even more obstinate so that he could show who really is God. And so glory ultimately comes to our God, and even the Egyptians have to, even those Egyptians who are more powerful than we are, had to acknowledge who God is. So that's probably the better answer to that question. Yeah.
All of the plagues seem to be temporary. You can't live with blood in the water for long.
No.
You can't stand the gnats that all prepared with the frogs or whatever. So all of these are temporary. Maybe also the killing of the lamb, the flocks, because you said they seem to keep coming back alive.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I suspect that there were different stories of these plagues. And maybe in one set of stories there were just a few plagues, and then they're finally brought together. You know, and you end up with 10 plagues. 10 would be a very good number. And these are remembered. For example, just listen for a moment to Psalm 105, where all of this is remembered in a poetic fashion. This is a very long psalm, but at one point in the psalm it recalls what happened there. I'm in Psalm 105, verse 23. Then Israel entered Egypt. Jacob sojourned in the land of Ham. God greatly increased his people, made them more numerous than their foes. He turned their hearts to hate his people, to treat his servants deceitfully. He sent his servant Moses and Aaron, whom he had chosen. They worked signs in Egypt and wonders in the land of Ham. He sent darkness, and it grew dark. Now that's the 9th plague. But they rebelled against his word. He turned the water into blood. That's the 1st plague. And it killed their fish. Their land swarmed with frogs, the 2nd plague, even the chambers of their kings. He spoke, and there came swarms of flies, the 3rd plague. Gnats throughout their country, the 4th plague. Rain, he gave them hail, the 9th plague. Flashes of lightning throughout their land. So, you know, this is told in different ways, and it's not as though this is an historical report, and in the year 1291, these 10 things happen one after another. What actually happened, we're just never going to know. What happened is that something happened, may not have been as glorious as all as that, but when the people thought about it and reflected upon it, they realized it was God's way of saving them. I don't know if that, yeah. Sure. Yeah.
You negate angels when you said the angel passed over. You said God passed over.
Yeah, but it's very often in the Old Testament, God is presented as an angel, the angel of the Lord. You can't quite describe God. And so, for example, you remember when the three men visit Abraham in the book of Genesis. And eventually, one of them is revealed as God. You know, so very often the angel of the Lord is just another way of talking about God. So at one point it talks about the avenging angel going over the houses of the Egyptians and the Israelites, but at another point it says, I will go over them. You know, so the avenging angel, if you want, is Yahweh. You know. What happens, all of these plagues then reappear again in the book of Revelation toward the end, you know, when all of these different plagues are put upon. Yeah. So it's kind of stock imagery in many ways. But I think the most important thing is, you know, is what all of this says about God, you know, and the power of God and God's committing himself to a people, redeeming that people. He committed himself to Moses, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He promises that their descendants are going to inherit this land. And now he commits God commits himself to this people by freeing them from the land of Egypt.